Hello. It's my pleasure to speak with my colleagues in Austria and Europe and around the world. And I'm going to share with you now some findings about cognitive science as a new people science for the future of work. I'm going to share with you a research brief, parts of a research brief from the MIT Work of the Future Task Force, of which I'm a member. The first author of the research brief is Frida Poli, CEO and founder of Pymetrics. And there's a link at the bottom of the slide for the entire report. So when we talk about hiring and employment, we typically start with resumes and interviews. But what I'm going to share with you now is that the scientific evidence is consistently showing that they have little value and have plenty of room for problems in good hiring and employment practices. So in the United States, for example, there's 50% more callbacks by employers for a white than Black name for otherwise identical resumes. And university science faculty rated otherwise identical resumes as better with a male than female name at the top of the resume, and suggested higher initial salaries to be offered to the males. So plenty of explicit and implicit bias occurs in reviewing resumes. What about interviews? Well, there's no scientific evidence that interviews improve hiring decisions. And in fact, where there's a little bit of evidence, there's a question about whether interviews help at all. So some researchers looked at medical school interviews that were used to admit or not admit applicants to medical school. And they found that medical school interviews used to determine admission failed to predict performance in medical school. So that candidates who were admitted or denied admission performed identically, showing that the interview really added nothing to accurately predicting their performance in medical school. In another laboratory study, people were asked to predict how well university students would perform in the following semester. What would be their grade point average in the following semester? And when they made these predictions, and they were related to the actual performance of the students, their predictions were worse when an interview was added, as opposed to simply looking at prior grade performance. So no evidence that interviews improve hiring decisions or predictions of future performance, and some evidence that it sometimes actually harms accurate prediction of future performance. So for people science, the traditional versus the new, and distinguishing between ways of evaluating human potential as one decides who to hire and employ. So traditional measures can be resumes and CVs, and we talked about the difficulties of those, standardized educational tests, personality inventories based on self-report. But there's all kinds of problems with those. And now there's an effort to take advantage of newer knowledge in cognitive science about how the mind works, and even in neuroscience about how the brain works, to improve the validity with which people might be identified for jobs in which they can flourish. So what do modern employers need? They need to understand the fit between a job candidate and the specific skills and abilities needed to do a job very well. This is good for the employer, but it's also good for the employee. People are happier when they flourish in their job. There's increasing interest in soft skills, how we communicate and work together in groups. And there's been very little development of ways to measure that, although there's some that are growing now. There's a lot of concern as a fairness in hiring, that no groups are advantaged, that there's not implicit or explicit bias. And there's ever increasing importance on skills related to flexibility. Technology is constantly changing the nature of jobs and job demands. And what are the kinds of skills that allow a person to migrate from one kind of job to another within the workplace as technology changes the environment in which they have to operate? So how do traditional people science measures fall short? Well, there's practically no specificity between a person's talents or skills and specific jobs. There's sort of monolithic measures where there's one number taken for any kind of job. There's virtually no measurement of soft skills. There's many consequences of traditional measures in terms of fairness, and I'll show you some more in a moment. And there's very little consideration of what kinds of skills people might have to be flexible in their future work, to move from one kind of work situation to another, as technology especially redefines the work they have to do. So here's an example of how current methods end up leading to bias. So measures of cognitive ability, situational judgment, job knowledge, and work sample, those are the kinds of assessments that have been commonly used. In North America, these kinds of assessments are occurred about from a quarter to a half or even more of employers. And these kinds of measures end up having an effect in terms of bias. So for all of these measures, the resultant ratio of hires is much higher for white applicants than Black applicants. And there's many reasons why these measures have problems that are well known, but now we can do better. So job fit, we can try to match particular skills to particular job demands. We can try to measure soft skills. We can work on making sure that hiring approaches or algorithms are fair. And we can try to measure abilities that underlie flexibility in how people do their jobs over time. And here's a few of these constructs that have been identified by cognitive science and neuroscience, and where there's more and more specific measures. For example, how well people can plan for something in the future, set up goals and follow them. Inhibitory control, can people block impulses, especially in the presence of conflicting signals? Reinforcement learning, can you evaluate the link between your actions and the consequences of those actions? Sustained attention, how long can you focus attention on a task? And trust, how well can you trust other people, which is very important for the soft skills and working in groups and partnerships. And Pymetrics, for example, has been working on developing AI algorithms that reduce bias. So here's the bias. This is for every 100 white candidates by a particular kind of assessment, how many Black candidates are selected. So measures of cognitive ability or work sample, job knowledge, situational judgment, resume reviews by other humans, all have a degree of prejudice or bias that's shown here that disfavor Black candidates. But with certain algorithms used to attempt to diminish that, a lot of that bias can be eliminated. So these are the kinds of things that we hope to make progress on for fair and effective hiring decisions in the future. Now, turning perhaps almost to science fiction, we can ask whether neuroimaging the brain can predict future performance. So are there brain characteristics that can be identified that predict individual differences in learning and performance? And I'll show you an example from brain structure and brain function. So one important thing that we have to do more and more in the workplace is know more than one language in this world of much interaction between people and nations. And so there's more and more requirement for adults to learn another language. English speakers, and we study here English speakers learning Mandarin Chinese, which is very different than English. It's a tonal language and it involves visual spatial characters instead of alphabetic letters. And what we ask is this: does variation in initial brain structure and function, this is before the foreign language learning, does it predict who will be better or worse at learning Chinese? So in this Mandarin training project, young adults came in and participated in 4 weeks of classroom-based training. They had 3.5-hour sessions every morning for 4 weeks. These were highly interactive classrooms with 12 to 13 students. There were 10 in-class quizzes, 11 assignments, and midterm and final exams. There were 24 participants. All of them were native English speakers, young adults, no prior exposure to either Chinese or similar tonal languages, and all with pretty good education backgrounds. At the end of the Mandarin Chinese classes, and also 90 days later, we gave them proficiency tests. How well had they learned Mandarin Chinese? How well do they understand Chinese when they're listening to it, when they're reading it, and when they're speaking? And we carefully measured these gained proficiencies after training. And one thing we found, which is very common in this field, is large individual differences in learning outcomes. Some adults picked up Chinese quite a bit, and others really struggled. So for example, here's attainment, how well they did immediately after the month of training. This is the farther along they are on the x-axis, the better they did. So it's better to score here. And this is the number of participants who had these scores. As you can see, there's a huge variation, with some people learning very well and some people learning not so well at all. And if we ask 90 days later, how well do they retain the knowledge that they learned, the long-term learning from this, again, we see this huge variation, with some people retaining a tremendous amount of information and others very little from the classroom Chinese experience. Now, we know that in speaking alphabetic languages like English or German, we know that the critical areas are in the left hemisphere for language, in Broca's area in the frontal lobe, and in Wernicke's area in the temporal and parietal lobe. But Chinese is different, because Chinese, unlike English or German, involves tonal processing and visuospatial processing of characters. These kinds of processing are right hemisphere dominant processes in English speakers. So we began to think that maybe something about the organization of the right hemisphere would predict initial learning of Mandarin Chinese. Now, we measured this in a couple of different ways, and first I'm going to show you something about brain anatomy. So here's a neuron. These cells, the neurons, bodies, create gray matter in the brain. And then the axons that leave the larger neurons are covered in a white matter called a myelin, which allows electrical signals to travel quickly and accurately the distance of the cell. When these are bundled together in groups of these cells, it becomes the white matter of the brain. So this is an MRI showing the top of the brain, bottom of the brain, and all of this is white matter. So white matter is really exciting because it's the network wiring of the brain, how different parts of the brain communicate with one another at a distance and collaborate and orchestrate higher level abilities in learning and thinking in the human mind and brain. And we can use a method to look at the white matter connectivity in each individual brain called diffusion tensor imaging. And what it really measures is the movement of water at very small distances, microns. So if you're a molecule of water floating around the cerebral spinal fluid in the brain, you can float anywhere you want. But if you're a molecule of water floating near a bunch of these myelinated axons, what's called a tract, you can't flow through it any more than you can walk through a desk or walk through a table. You have to walk around it. And so the water has to flow parallel to these axons in the brain. And using that information, we can reconstruct the wiring of an individual person's brain. So this is constructed by the flow of water. Red signals pathways that travel between the left and right hemispheres. Blue signals pathways that seem to flow up and down in the brain, connecting cortical areas to subcortical regions. And green are areas that seem to connect the front and back of the brain. And then we can examine this individual person's brain and the network wiring of that brain for that individual person as measured by diffusion tensor imaging. And what we found was this: the stronger the white matter tracts were in the right hemisphere, the better individuals learn Chinese. So let's pick this one pathway. Here's a measure of the strength of that pathway. Each dot is a different person in the course. And this is their final exam score. So this person did the best in the class, or one of the best scores in the class. This person had one of the worst scores in the class. And we could see distinct differences in the strength of the white matter connectivity in the brain. So remember, this is before they took any of the course. Something about their brain anatomy before they started the course made it easier or harder to learn Chinese. And we also looked at brain function, functional MRI. And before, again, the students learned anything in Chinese, they listened to lexical tones, Chinese-like tones. And we found that the more the right frontal cortex responded to that, the better they learned Chinese in the coming month. And the better they remembered the Chinese 3 months later. So here we see brain differences before learning begins that predicts how well people learn and perform a complex everyday task. Now that's in an MRI scanner. And here we can ask whether learning science can improve actual workplace learning. Can we move from the laboratory to the workplace and improve outcomes for employees and workers? So in the United States, corporations spend over $1,000 per employee each year for direct learning and development. Estimated in 2015 is $180 billion. About half of this workplace learning involves instructor-led live classrooms, and about half of them also involve technology platforms. So back to the laboratory for a moment, and a really exciting discovery some years ago, which is what's a really effective way to learn, called a test practice effect or retrieval effect. And here's what they found. Participants were exposed to some information, and then their memory was tested for it. And here's how well they did. What if they studied that information twice? Well, repetition helps, and they remembered the information considerably better. They almost doubled their memory. But what about a third group of people who studied it once and then were tested on that material? What was their memory like later on? And that was the best of all. Being tested on information is a powerful way to remember that information. So these people actually studied it more, but getting a test on that really improved long-term memory for information that was being learned. So that's in the laboratory. What happens if you do have a collaboration with a large corporation, Accenture, and you use actual videos they use in training their actual employees, and these studies were done in the workplace. And this was a video that was required for many of their individuals on development and operations, effective delivery of information. And many of their IT products and IT professionals are required to see this video. So in collaboration with Accenture, we divided employees into 4 groups randomly. One group watched the video as it is current practice. They simply watched the video. A second group watched the video and then had a discussion with other peer employees about the video they had just seen. A third group watched the video, and then they had a structured discussion with a live instructor about the video they had just seen. And the fourth group, and the one that was critical for us, watched the video, but while they were watching the video, they would get an occasional, pretty easy test question about what they had just seen. And then the next day, all of these groups were tested to see what did they remember from the video. I mean, there's not much logic in showing a video if you don't remember much of it. So we presume the goal of having people watch the video is to remember the content of it so they can use it in future work. And here's what we found. Here's the performance. This is post-test memory for what was studied. So higher is better. The usual practice is simply watching the video. Having a spontaneous peer discussion about that, not much better. Having a discussion after the video with a live instructor that's very well organized, to about 20% improvement. And now, having those occasional test questions along the way, also a 27% improvement in remembering the information from the video. These two are equal, but this is free. This costs you nothing. This involves hiring an instructor and organizing groups. So this can be done individually and practically for free. It only adds a couple minutes to the entire process. So this is showing you how laboratory knowledge about what makes for effective learning from the learning sciences can improve actual workplace learning for employees with required videos for work. So I've shown you something about cognitive science as a new people science for the future of work, how objective measures can identify job candidates best suited for a job in a new and better way, more valid and less biased. And we've emphasized it for selection of an appropriate person for an appropriate job. But of course, it can also be used and should be used for support. Most jobs have multiple facets, and a particular person might be strong in some and need a little bit of extra training or support in another. I've shown you that neural imaging the brain can predict variation among adults and how well they can learn a language. I've shown you how learning science can improve workplace learning and training. And all of this is an exciting possibility of partnerships between companies that want employees who are effective and happy and successful, and researchers, and how working together, maybe they can increase worker success and worker happiness and decrease bias in hiring. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Gabrieli. And now for some questions from our audience. You showed us how brain imaging can identify people well suited to learning a foreign language, Chinese. Do you think brain imaging might play a part in future employment decisions?
Well, my career is in brain imaging, and I'm always enthusiastic about how widely it might be used, but I do not see us wheeling multiple-ton MRI scanner into the HR department of any company in the near future. So a couple of different things. Number one is, I think the brain imaging just shows us that people have capacities that we can measure that predict how well they'll do at particular tasks. We looked at learning Chinese, but different kinds of tasks may tap different parts of the brain, and we strongly suspect they would. So we can really match specific brain capacities in structure and function to different kinds of learning and performance. And we can form a basic sort of underlying science to discover what those different dimensions can be, and then find practical ways to use that and translate that into the workplace. There's a small chance that some other kinds of brain measures might be applicable in the future. EEG is increasingly flexible, used to involve gels and lots of other stuff, but now it can be wireless and without gels, and just slide a cap onto your head. There's also something called FNIRS, which is a pretty easy form of functional MRI that doesn't involve much equipment and could be housed in offices. So it's not out of the question that in the future, brain measures might be part of the mix. But I think that for quite some time, it's more just helping us build a basic science or people science of understanding how different abilities can be identified and identifying those abilities in individuals and matching them up to specific job requirements. You know, I've always had the experience that if there's a good match between an individual set of strengths and specific job requirements, that's always the happiest person in their job, does the best job, and lots of good things happen. The toughest cases are where there's a person who just does not seem to have the right set of skills for a particular job, and that's always a difficult slog for everybody involved.
And now for our second question. You shared with us the outcome of a study that showed how the cognitive science of learning could enhance learning in the workplace with an actual employer, Accenture. Do you think scientists and employers can collaborate to improve worker education and development in the real workplace?
I was delighted to have this collaboration with Accenture. It's a rare opportunity to have a collaboration between scientific researchers and actual employers and to work together to improve workplace learning. I think that we should do as much of this as we can. There's a number of practical issues in terms of privacy of employees and companies, and so all of that would have to be thought through, but we're used to dealing with privacy issues. And I'm involved in a lot of medical research, and privacy is a huge issue in that. So I don't think that has to be a roadblock. It has to be thought through carefully that everybody's rights and privacy are protected. But the benefits could be great because, again, there's nothing better than having the right person for the right job, avoiding biases, avoiding hiring somebody for whom a job is frustrating and unsuccessful. If we can have a more rational, more scientific understanding of how to couple the best person to the best job and also on-the-job training. We know that the workplace is changing more and more quickly as technology and artificial intelligence sort of shape our world. And so the ability to improve learning and training for people at work already, to make it more effective so that when they get trained, they actually remember that information and are capable of using that information, that seems like a huge benefit for everybody involved. So I think there can be major benefits. And it's really important because we don't want to do everything in the laboratory and not know if it really applies or how to apply it best to the real world of employment. So the more we can have real partnerships, just like we have partnership with physicians, and for example, I work in mental health again, and we work with psychiatrists and clinical psychologists because we want to know whether our understanding of how things differ in a mental health situation matters and whether it relates, for example, to how well patients do. So similarly, in a different domain, the more we can understand how employees can be identified who will flourish in a job and how their training can be enhanced once they're in that job, it seems to me that everybody wins, and we need that practical relationship or partnership between scientists who can measure things and employers who really understand what matters in the workplace for their employees to flourish.